Hello.
Welcome back to the Space School, and we're back with what if Ahsoka was executed for the Jedi Temple bombing. Otherwise, before we begin, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else part of my team. Thank you for your continuous support throughout my move. I'm finally settled in. As you can hear, it's not really the most acoustic environment yet, so I'm still working on that, but otherwise, our story begins inside the judiciary courts of the Galactic Republic. Ahsoka Tano was accused by the Republic for committing heinous crimes against both the Republic and the Jedi Order. Ahsoka wasn't even on the planet of Coruscant when it happened, but through a series of unfortunate events, she found herself at the center of controversy and under the fire of the Republic for committing an act of terror on the Jedi Temple. Typically, if the temple had been bombed and it only affected the Jedi, it would have been handled by the Jedi. But considering this was a bombing that claimed the lives of several others, especially those who worked for the Republic, it was now a Republic problem. For officials of the Republic, like Captain Tarkin, this was outrageous and it needed to be dealt with at the highest degree, sentencing of death. While Ahsoka was in a trial to defend herself from a crime she did not commit, Anakin Skywalker was in the lower parts of Coruscant, looking for former Separatist agent Asajj Ventress. Ahsoka assumed it was Ventress who framed her, but the truth is, it wasn't Ventress. It was her friend Barriss Offee. Ahsoka didn't know, and she couldn't do anything but sit there helpless as one of the men she rescued from the Citadel rallied together a case that would end her life, while the Jedi Council sat up above and watched her get torn apart by the prosecutor. Palpatine also watched from above. While none of this was actually his doing, it worked out in his favor. See, Palpatine knew at some point he needed to get rid of Ahsoka so that he could take a hold of Anakin Skywalker, but the truth is he hadn't really gotten around to that part of the plan. But when Ahsoka accidentally let herself into the situation, Palpatine couldn't help but use the ruse as a perfect opportunity to push Anakin further to the dark side. And who else would be the perfect scapegoat other than Captain Tarkin? It was obvious that Tarkin didn't like the Jedi, and while that was fine and all, Tarkin was a true loyalist to Palpatine, and he could make him do anything he wanted him to do. Tarkin would take a hold of the court case and become the prosecutor for the case. He would levy the worst charges down on the Jedi Padawan, and from there, in Tarkin's mind, the Jedi would lose their popularity. Tarkin's involvement in this mostly moved towards his dissatisfaction with the Jedi. This was because they weren't good generals. Their focus on peace kept weighing them down in the war effort, and that focus on peace kept ruining their ability to be true warriors in combat. Regardless, the trial was grueling. Padme Amidala was Ahsoka's defense, and she wasn't really getting anywhere. The public was outraged that a Jedi would kill innocent civilians. The Republic officials were pissed because employees of the Republic were hurt and killed in the blast. And of course, the Jedi couldn't believe someone of their own would do that, let alone Skywalker's apprentice. While most of the council voted against Ahsoka, there were those that believed she was innocent. During the trial, Ahsoka tried to stand up for herself, but the simple truth is there was nearly nothing she could do to defend herself. She was seen on camera choking a suspect in the investigation, and while that wasn't the truth, the audio was accidentally missing from the clip, and so there was no way for Ahsoka to actually defend herself. The real culprit was sitting quietly inside of the Jedi Temple, and the person they assumed was the real culprit had actually bounced off-world. Because Asajj would have loved to have her lightsaber, she knew that Ahsoka could become a threat to her by suggesting that she was the one who actually bombed the Jedi Temple. Anakin was covering the cities of Coruscant, trying to find his only lead on the case. If he couldn't find Asajj, then Ahsoka was possibly going to be convicted. While Anakin believed in Padme and believed that she would put up a good case in court, he didn't know if the court would overwhelm her case. Inside the court itself, that's exactly what was happening. Tarkin forced his hand and made the jury vote against Ahsoka Tano, and so when the votes were cast, she was overwhelmingly convicted of the bombing of the Jedi Temple. Ahsoka's heart fell into her stomach. Two shock troopers walked up behind her, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her back. Tarkin stood amused in his accomplishment, while Palpatine stood looking over with wishful thoughts plaguing his mind. Padme's heart also filled with sadness as she watched Anakin's student essentially be dragged out of the courtroom. The Jedi watched with sorrow, especially Obi-Wan, Yoda, Plo Koon, and Shaak Ti. The sight was hard to see, one of their own convicted of a felony. The worry for the masters of Obi-Wan and Yoda was how Skywalker would react. The sad truth is the fact that Anakin had no clue. He was still in the underbelly of Coruscant, still believing there was time or a chance to save Ahsoka, neither of which being true or close to true. Ahsoka was taken away, and no one could do anything but helplessly watch. Padme pulled out her communicator and tried to get into communication with Skywalker, and so that she could inform him of what was happening at the moment. but his signal wasn't coming through. To the left, a little bit above, Obi-Wan was doing the exact same thing. He didn't want Anakin to come back and lose everything, but he also couldn't get in contact with Anakin. The lower city was blocking off frequencies as it typically did, especially from the Galactic Republic Justice Building. The shock troopers dragged Ahsoka into another small room and locked her up to a chair and grabbed a small vessel. One of the clones looked at Ahsoka, and his heart rang with sadness. The other clone was grabbing the vessel, and his hands were very unsteady. The room was locked, and no one was permitted to enter or see what was happening. Ahsoka sat in the chair biting her lip, with a single tear sitting in her eye. She couldn't believe what was happening, or what happened. She felt so betrayed, and now she would die, only 17 years old, with so much more ahead of her, and so she would be killed by the clones she served with. While sure the shock troopers were stationed on Coruscant and never went into active combat, they did go to 79's, the clone trooper bar on Coruscant, and they interacted with many of the men of the 501st. The boys in blue were always talking about how amazing their generals were. Ahsoka was like a younger sister to many of the men of the 501st. They loved her and they cared for her as she did them. The two clones couldn't even bear to do what their orders were, but they did so anyways. One of the clones knelt down and took off his helmet and told Ahsoka that he was deeply sorry. She looked over at him as a tear fell down her face and she told him that it wasn't his fault. That weight didn't have to be on either of their shoulders. They were simply following orders that they should have no reason to hold themselves responsible for, because it was a failure of the Jedi and the courts. He looked at her and then over to his brother, who looked down at the vessel and then back to Ahsoka, who closed her eyes. The clone looked over at his brother and moved over to Ahsoka's shoulder and knelt down to be adjacent. He placed the vessel on her arm and pressed it down. The clone whose helmet was off placed his hand on Ahsoka's to try and give her some comfort. She squeezed his hand as tight as she could. The other clone did the same on her other hand, and she did the same, squeezing as tight as she could, until her grip started to lose strength, and it slowly began to fade into an open, cold, lifeless hand. The trooper with the helmet off placed his hand over his eyes and lowered his head. The clone whose helmet was on looked away. He caught a reflection of himself on a metallic table next to him. He felt so embarrassed to be a clone. He felt like a traitor to everything he believed in because he didn't believe Ahsoka would ever do something so vile and heinous. The other trooper stood up and grabbed his helmet. He spoke, but his voice cracked like there was a boulder sitting in his throat as he told his brother that it was time to go. The two brothers sighed and moved towards the exit as one trooper placed his helmet on and the other brother opened the door. His brother asked him if it was all worth it, and the response was resoundingly quick, no. They turned around and saw Ahsoka's body fall limp in the chair, and then the last clone pulled a lever, releasing both the body and the chair into the floor below them, dropping Ahsoka's lifeless corpse into an incinerator below. Hours later, Anakin would arrive at the court building, trying to have a talk with Ahsoka, and when he arrived, he found Obi-Wan standing silently, surrounded by no one else. Anakin ran forward and asked Obi-Wan if Ahsoka was okay. Obi-Wan turned around and looked at Anakin with a momentary look of silence on his face. His mouth was pressed back and his heart raced as he tried to find the words. Obi-Wan had thought about how he would say it, but he couldn't find the words to articulate what he wanted to say. Anakin put his hand on Obi-Wan's shoulder and asked again if Ahsoka was okay. A tear fell down from Obi-Wan's eye, and he told him that she was one with the Force. Anakin stumbled back. His heart fell into his stomach and his legs fell weak under him. Anakin looked around as his vision became foggy and his feelings were overrun with pain. Obi-Wan reached out for a student and grabbed a hold of Anakin as he fell heavy into his arms. Anakin started hitting Obi-Wan's shoulder as tears flooded his eyes. Obi-Wan slowly brought Anakin down to the ground and held his former student, telling him that it would all be okay. Anakin tried putting words together, trying to make sense of everything, but Obi-Wan just stayed silent, rubbing Anakin's back and keeping him as calm as possible. Anakin eventually stopped hitting Obi-Wan's shoulders and fell limp into his arms. Anakin's mind raced and raced. He couldn't figure out how it all happened. He didn't understand why it happened. It was all unfair. It was too unfair. It was just wrong. Everything didn't make sense. How could the Jedi, how could the Council, how could the Republic, how could Tarkin, how could Palpatine all turn their back on Ahsoka? She saved Tarkin more than once at the Citadel. She was a terrific student at the Temple. She was a general for the Republic and she was Anakin's student, and yet no one stood up for her. Anakin felt so betrayed, and at the very least he never got a chance to say goodbye to his student. He never got to say goodbye to his best friend, and one he considered his little sister. And that hurt his heart more than anything. Anakin fell silent in both mind and body, almost like a ghost. He slowly got back up after several minutes of hysteria. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin, and he looked pale. His eyes were weak, and under them bags that looked as if they weighed more than a star cruiser. Anakin's posture was slouched, and his voice was coarse. Anakin looked at Obi-Wan and said 3 words, "I failed her." The echo crossed both sides of the corridor and bounced back into Obi-Wan's ears, and Obi-Wan spoke up to tell Anakin that he didn't fail Ahsoka. It was everyone else who failed her. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she was falsely accused. Anakin looked away and told Obi-Wan that he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to go on. Obi-Wan looked at him and placed his hand on Anakin's shoulder and said that Ahsoka's life would be in vain if he didn't go on. Anakin looked back at his master and nodded his head, and looked down at the floor as they both walked side by side out of the building. There was a Jedi vessel waiting for them as Obi-Wan ushered Anakin inside. Anakin felt so vulnerable, and he couldn't even imagine mustering up the strength to enter the Jedi Temple. Anakin kept his eyes peeled onto his boots in the lower part of the cockpit, and when the vessel stopped, he thanked Obi-Wan for flying them back. And then he looked up. Anakin looked over at Obi-Wan with concern on his face. Obi-Wan smiled softly and told Anakin that it was okay, and to go. Anakin turned back and stepped out of the cockpit and walked up a couple of steps. C-3PO was there to greet him, and then from around the corner came Padme. Anakin turned back around and Obi-Wan flew off into the distance back towards the Jedi Temple. Padme ran forward and asked if Anakin was alright. She could see it from a mile away that he wasn't. Anakin simply sat down on the sofa in the middle of the room and Padme got down next to him. She told him how sorry she was, but Anakin told her it wasn't her fault. It was the failure of the Jedi, the Republic, and of the court. One thing after another, everyone failed Ahsoka, and while it could have been easy to simply blame Padme, it wasn't her that was solely responsible for what happened to Ahsoka. The two of them hugged for a long period of time. Both Padme and Anakin were terribly saddened by what happened to Ahsoka. When the morning eventually came along, Anakin was tired as could be. He spent most of the night lying awake, without the ability to sleep. He had a couple moments where he was able to sleep, but he was jolted awake, and he couldn't sleep afterwards. Anakin looked at his communicator. There was a message from Obi-Wan. It read similarly to what he had said the day before. There was nothing that he could do, and it wasn't his fault. Anakin was a terrific master. Ahsoka knew that, and she loved him for that. Obi-Wan reiterated that Ahsoka loved being his student. Another message came in from Plo Koon, and the message was very simple. His message read that Anakin was very strong, and from his strength he raised a Padawan that was one of the best he'd ever seen. Anakin should show on his strength in this moment, because it's what made him not just a good man, but a good Jedi. And while Plo could never actually experience the vast array of emotions that Anakin could, he admitted that Skywalker was always the bravest of the Jedi because of his emotions, and through his bravery he would ascend this travesty. There was no message from anyone else, not Windu, nor Yoda, not Shakti, nor Jocasta Nu. But something else was the fact that there wasn't a message for Anakin from Palpatine. Anakin told Padme that he would be heading towards the Jedi Temple. Padme told Anakin that she loved him before he departed, and he told her the same. When Anakin arrived at the Jedi Temple, he ran into Shakti. She had been waiting for him. She'd much rather talk to him in person. Shakti checked on Anakin's room and found that he wasn't there, and so she stationed herself at the steps of the Jedi Temple, waiting for him to return. She'd actually been there since the late evening and didn't move. She walked with Anakin and spoke with him. Shakti was always a lot more empathetic of a Jedi Master, and she was always someone that could convey a lot more emotion than any other Jedi. She had a natural maternal instinct that a lot of Jedi couldn't have. Of course there were some, but that was very, very rare. Shakti was one of those rarities, and she inflicted such feelings on people. She talked with Anakin and how he was feeling. Part of Anakin wanted to tell her everything, but the other part of him wanted to be as quiet as possible. He couldn't tell if Shakti was on an operative of the Jedi Council, trying to convince him of his emotions so that they could oust him too. But that was far from the truth. Shakti just wanted to make sure that he was alright. They walked and talked, and they made their way around to the garden of the Jedi Temple, and Shakti brought Anakin down to the tree and told him that back on Shili, the Togruta people would often find remembrance of those they loved in the nature around them. One could find them in the stars, and one could find them in the seas or in the trees. Shakti told Anakin to close his eyes, and he did, as she reached forward and gently grabbed his hand and led him down to the foot of the tree. She reached down with his hand and made him grab a handful of dirt. Shakti told Skywalker to open his eyes, and so he did. He looked at Shakti and she told him to look down, and so he did. When Anakin looked down, there was a solitary seed in his hand, surrounded by pieces of dirt. Shakti told Anakin to take that seed and take care of it, because it would always be a reminder of what was and what will always be. Ahsoka may have been gone, but she was forever with him. A tear fell down Anakin's eye as he looked at Master Shakti. She placed her hand on Anakin and closed her eyes, speaking softly, telling Anakin that if he trusted in the Force, everything would work out the best way it possibly could. Shakti kept her hand on Anakin's shoulder as a tear dried at the edge of his cheek. He looked over at her, and Shakti smiled. She told Anakin and reminded him that the Council was always here for him, and if that didn't feel adequate, then at the very least, Masters Kenobi, Yoda, Plo, and her were always available. Anakin thanked Shakti. Her calming presence put an ease in his heart as he sat down at the bottom of the steps, and Shakti walked away. Anakin spent time alone with the seed, and he saw a way of which Shakti was referring to. He could take care of this plant, nurture it, and inspire its growth by shedding rays of sunshine down onto it. When it rained, it would give it new life, and he could almost continue the life of Ahsoka, while she may have departed and became one with the Force. Anakin would return to life inside the temple, and when he returned to his quarters, he would be visited by Grandmaster Yoda. Anakin wasn't too excited to see Yoda, especially considering he assumed it was Yoda that forced the vote, but Yoda spoke up, apologizing for the incident. Yoda spoke to Anakin and told him that on behalf of the Council, that they wanted to all apologize for the incident. Anakin was confused. Yoda admitted that the Republic forced their hand in the vote. Yoda told Anakin that the Council never wanted to force Ahsoka into the case because they all believed that she was innocent. But Palpatine and Tarkin told the Jedi that if they didn't force one of their members out of the Order for a public trial, then the Republic would be forced to levy the Jedi as insurrectionists of the Greater Republic. Yoda profusely apologized, explaining that the Council was under no awareness that the trial itself would have such a deadly outcome, being that Tarkin only said it would be years of jail time, and then Ahsoka would have the ability to rejoin the Jedi Order after she spent time in jail. That was a lie told by Tarkin on behalf of the Chancellor, and while Yoda didn't know that, he informed Skywalker that because of the egregious decisions both by the Republic, the Chancellor, and Captain Tarkin forcing Ahsoka out of the temple and into execution, the Jedi Council wanted to welcome him into their ranks as a Jedi Master. Anakin paused momentarily. He was seated on his bed, and he asked Yoda what he meant, to which Yoda explained that while Anakin had unorthodox methods, he was a fine teacher, and he produced a fine student. In the eyes of the Council, Anakin resembled that of a young Dooku or a Quinlan Vos, and both Quinlan and Dooku at one point were offered seats on the High Council. The Council believed it to be their best interest to offer Skywalker a seat on the Council, because they believed he was worthy of the title Master. Anakin told Master Yoda that while that was a great honor, and while that sounded really kind, he wasn't sure how to feel about becoming a Jedi Master after he failed his student. Yoda told Skywalker that it was the Jedi who failed both Anakin and Ahsoka. Yoda admitted that the Council should have been seen through the lies of the Republic, and rejected the idea, admitting that a few of the Council members saw through the belligerent lies of the Republic and that of Captain Tarkin. Anakin told Master Yoda that he appreciated the sentiment, but he didn't believe that he was able to attain the role of Master without having passed the trials, and had a Jedi Padawan become a Jedi Knight. Anakin told Yoda that had Ahsoka become a Jedi Knight and passed her trials, then he would accept the role. Yoda understood and gained a lot of respect for Anakin in a solitary moment. Yoda then told Anakin that if he ever wanted to change his mind, the rank of Master was within reach, and becoming a member of the Jedi Council wasn't either far away. It was just up to him if he wanted it or not. Yoda turned and stopped. He turned around and informed Anakin that if he had any reason to believe he was a failure of a teacher, he should rid his mind of that. Anakin asked why, as Yoda smiled and told Skywalker that there were hundreds of students that wanted to be his next. They were all waiting for Ahsoka to finish her trials so that they could become the student of the Anakin Skywalker. Yoda chuckled and reminded Anakin that he was an inspiration to many across the Jedi Order, not just the younglings. Yoda had a glimmer in his eyes as he said that, and turned around and walked out of the room. Anakin paused for a moment and wondered if Yoda was referring to himself being inspired by Skywalker. Anakin didn't really know what to do, so he laid down and tried to take a nap. Next to his bed, inside of a little pot, was a seed from earlier. Anakin departed in sleep, and the next thing he knew, he was leading the 501st in the battle. This wasn't a dream, he was on the front lines, destroying battle droids and those who opposed the Republic. Anakin and the boys in blue had moved on without Ahsoka, and while it was hard, war was war, and they were trying to win. The clones of the 501st rushed the front lines of the droids and overtook it. Truly, this was a joint operation with the 501st and the 212, but as always, it was Anakin's battalion leading the charge, and Obi-Wan's picking up the rest. Obi-Wan and Anakin stood side by side and talked with each other. Obi-Wan told Anakin that he was very proud of him. Anakin smiled at Obi-Wan until he got a communication from the vessel above. It was Admiral Yularen informing them that there was a new communication coming in from Mandalore. It was Bo-Katan, and she was reaching out to the Jedi for help. Without Ahsoka, Bo-Katan was trying to get in contact with Obi-Wan Kenobi to assist her in her war against Maul. When the two Jedi arrived inside the Venator, tensions were naturally high. Bo-Katan was livid that Kenobi didn't send reinforcements after she helped him escape, and for Obi-Wan, he didn't really care for the sister that helped get Satine killed. Not for nothing, she didn't just get Satine killed, she helped her planet become enslaved by Maul. That's egregious as it was. Regardless, Obi-Wan allowed Bo-Katan to say her purpose, to which she informed the Jedi that the people in Mandalore were suffering, and because of their suffering, they needed help from the Republic. Anakin wasn't nearly as interested in going to war with Mandalore, and neither was Kenobi. While he would have liked to see Mandalore thrive, it was out of his control, and it certainly wasn't within the realm of control for the Republic. Bo-Katan made it literally impossible for the Republic to help without breaking treaties and declaring war on Mandalore. Bo-Katan was visibly upset, to which she tried to manipulate Obi-Wan by throwing shade at him and accusing him of not caring for Satine, to which Obi-Wan responded with even more shade, reminding Bo-Katan of her place in all of this. Obi-Wan continued after telling Bo that her sister stood for peace, and it would be a dishonor to her legacy to invade the planet because Bo got herself into a situation she couldn't resolve alone. Bo was silent. Obi-Wan's stance was strong and heavy, and he told Bo that while he didn't want Maul alive, because of the atrocities he could commit, there was a war that the Republic was focused on, right now. Had Bo-Katan chosen any other path, maybe it would have fared better for the people of Mandalore, but currently, they were not a top priority of the Republic. Obi-Wan turned the communication off without allowing Bo to continue a rebuttal. Anakin asked if Obi-Wan was alright. Kenobi nodded his head and told Anakin that while, as a Jedi, they were meant to assist those in need, it was Mandalore. It was a Mandalorian civil war. Maul wanted the Jedi there for some reason, and he had no intention of allowing the Jedi to be sidetracked at the pivotal moment of the Clone War. Anakin asked what he meant. Obi-Wan continued by suggesting that while Maul was belligerent, he wasn't stupid. He was very calculated, and he made every effort he could to ensure his own success. Pulling the Jedi away from the front lines could prove to be a useful ally to this Darth Sidious. Anakin kinda understood in his own way. For the past several months, Anakin made a very incredible recovery. Yes, it still haunted him, and yes, he was very angry. His anger, though, wasn't directed at the Jedi. Anakin was rather upset that Palpatine pushed for the death of his student, and didn't even reach out to him. Of course, a couple days after, Palpatine and Anakin did meet up, because Palpatine requested Anakin to his office, but nothing like what the Jedi had done since the execution. Anakin was still rather sleepless most nights, but on the other hand, he was doing alright. He was focused on the success of the battlefield. When the war ended, he believed he would have made Ahsoka truly proud. Ending this war was the biggest conquest to Anakin, though moments later Yularen would inform them that they needed to head to Coruscant. The Republic was under attack and the Chancellor was captured. Anakin told Obi-Wan that it was a good thing they weren't going to Mandalore. Obi-Wan nodded his head and smiled at Anakin. The Battle of Coruscant would come and go quickly, and Dooku's death would come swiftly at the hands of Skywalker, but his regret would be very obvious. When he returned to Coruscant, Palpatine would appoint him to the High Council, and while that was cool and all, Anakin couldn't shake the feelings he felt from killing Dooku. So when he returned to the Jedi Temple, he went to his room before he visited the council chambers. Inside of his room, he sat down on his bed and quietly thought. He took off his boots and looked over at the little plant which was sprouting a cute little strain of life. It wasn't much, but it was just enough that Anakin could see. Anakin thought back on the man that Dooku was. While yes, he was a criminal, and yes, he had committed atrocities, executing him was no better than what was done to Ahsoka. The execution was in his hands. And then Anakin connected the dots. Anakin's heart fell to his feet. He apologized to the little plant and made his way towards the council chambers. His thoughts raced on as he started connecting the dots, concocting this idea in his mind, and he didn't know how he was going to express it to the High Council. When he got there, he stood before the Masters and informed them that the Chancellor's decision was to put him on the Council. Windu leaned back and looked over at Yoda. Anakin spoke up, cutting through the tension and the silence. Anakin said he knew he was welcome to the Council, but the truth is he believed there was a conspiracy coming from the office of the Chancellor. Windu and Yoda looked at Anakin with confusion as Skywalker stated that he believed it was wildly weird that the Chancellor would force him onto the Council after forcing him to execute Dooku, after forcing the hand that would execute Ahsoka. Obi-Wan looked up at Anakin with confusion and almost spoke up, as Anakin then continued. He told the Council that while he appreciated their offer to make him a Council member and a Master, it seemed manipulative that Palpatine was forcing his hand on the Jedi, and Anakin couldn't really stand the idea of being the executioner for a man who said, "Execute her." The Council looked at Skywalker as he continued and told them that he would like to become a Jedi Master and a Council member on behalf of the Jedi Order and not that of the Chancellor. Yoda was fine with this, but he asked why Anakin was keen on doing so now, before any other time when he could have. Skywalker spoke up and said it was because the war was nearing its completion, and if the Council believed he was worthy, they would put his best foot forward on behalf of the Republic, the Jedi, and the people of the galaxy. The Council accepted this motion and made Anakin a Jedi Master on the High Council. It wouldn't be until after this meeting that Anakin was told about his mission to spy on the Chancellor. Anakin was actually perfectly fine with this. He had a grudge against the Chancellor for what he had done to his student, and while yes, the Jedi had a part to play in it, if it wasn't for Yoda, Shakti, Obi-Wan, and Plo Koon all reaching out to him, he would have felt much different about the entire thing. Regardless, Anakin was invited out to a bubble show with the Chancellor, to which he would find out that General Grievous was discovered on Utapau. Palpatine would tell Skywalker he believed he would be best suited to lead the invasion of Utapau and take on Grievous. Anakin nodded his head silently. Palpatine was confused. He noticed Anakin's distance since the end of the war, but it just naturally assumed that it was Anakin's healing process. The same thing happened after Shmi's death. Sure, the two of them talked about it and Palpatine tried to pin it on the Jedi, but Anakin had enough time to develop his own feelings about the death of Ahsoka, and towards the topic that he didn't really see the Jedi as a people who should be blamed for it. On the other hand, Palpatine told Anakin about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, and he thought this to be a really weird thing for a Chancellor, a politician nonetheless, to know, and so he confronted the Council about it. Currently, Windu, Saesee Tiin, Shakti, Kit Fisto, Egg and Kolar, and a few others were present on Coruscant, and they found this to be rather odd coming from the Chancellor. Windu told Skywalker to contact Master Yoda for his input on the situation. The bond between Anakin and Mace was still odd. It wasn't exactly a bad one, but it was rather weird. They had a hard time seeing eye to eye from time to time, but overall, they didn't hate or even dislike each other. They more or less got along, but found it better, especially for the two of them, to have discussion-based interactions. They achieved more from them, and that's how they got along. They saw eye to eye by not seeing eye to eye. It worked. It was much more functional than the relationship before, and that's all that mattered. Anakin spoke to Yoda about the situation and the encounter with Palpatine, and Yoda suggested that Anakin trust the will of the Force. He believed that if Anakin believed Palpatine was this Darth Sidious, then he should trust the Force and allow it into the city building. If not, then the war would be almost over and everything could be resolved. Anakin was in a tough spot. While yes, he had the case on his hands, he was also having nightmares about the death of his wife. Being a Jedi Master, without Palpatine knowing, was keeping him sane. Anakin had access to the restricted section of the Jedi archives, and because of this, he had no inclination to truly paralyze himself with fear over the possibility of Padme's death. Though this Palpatine thing was really bugging him, and so he confronted the Council after talking to Master Yoda, and informed them of what the Grand Master told him. The Council told Anakin that they would go with him if he went, or they would stay behind. They respected him as a Council member, and they believed he would make the correct decision in this moment. And so Anakin told them that they would go to the Senate building to confront the Chancellor. They immediately left. Skywalker, Windu, Fisto, Tin, Kolar, Kajak, and Shakti. 6 Jedi Masters all headed across the city in the middle of the day. The city was bustling and everyone was on the move, including the Jedi. Kenobi had just engaged General Grievous and the Chancellor had not yet found out about it. The Jedi arrived in force, but they allowed Skywalker's move to go in first. This was his op, and they were going to make sure that whatever happened, he was in control of its beginning and of its outcome. Palpatine was very noticeably shocked by the crowd that Skywalker brought with him, especially considering the fact that Palpatine hadn't ever revealed that he knew the nature of the dark side. Palpatine stood up and asked if this is what Anakin wanted to really do. Anakin told Palpatine that he wanted to know why Palpatine had extended his knowledge on Sith lore that not even the Jedi knew about. Palpatine dug himself into a corner here, and so he secured himself in his corner and took everything coming from the Jedi as an absolute threat. Palpatine was on the edge, and all the Jedi could do was feel it. The Jedi began to spread out across the room as Anakin demanded that Palpatine answer the question. Palpatine asked why, to which Anakin told him that it was for Republic security. If he didn't answer it, then it was possible that he was aligned with the Sith. Palpatine began to fiddle with his sleeve, to which the Jedi all simultaneously, other than Anakin, moved their hands to their lightsabers. Palpatine was quick as he moved to ignite both of his lightsabers and moved across the room. Windu yelled out for Skywalker to get down, and pushed him out of the way, igniting his amethyst blade and defending Anakin from a near-death experience. The Jedi all rallied together, whipping their weapons out, and the battle began. It was a duel for the ages, and the Jedi fought their hardest. Coleman Kajak was cut down by Sidious as he moved around, trying for each of the Jedi, cutting through Agnan Kolar and Saesee Tiin. Shakti, Mace Windu, Kit Fisto, and Anakin Skywalker were all much too talented to be defeated by Sidious while fighting together, and so they swiftly put an end to the Sith. During the day, this got the attention of several Coruscant guardsmen present, and they all ran in, but Anakin was a buffer for the Jedi to clean up the mess. He informed the guard that this was Jedi business, and shoot him off. The Republic would deal with this adequately. Being that their disdain for the Jedi was still ever so present, the Jedi would present the information revealing Palpatine's involvement in the war, including messages to Castle Sereno, the home of Count Dooku, and even messages to the Invisible Hand, the same vessel that captured him during the Battle of Coruscant. With the defeat of Grievous at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Separatists would be destroyed. With a resounding Republic victory, Jedi Masters Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker would be sent to Mandalore, undercover, in which they would find and kill Darth Maul. While on Mandalore, Luke and Leia would be born on Coruscant, to which Anakin would be so pleasantly surprised when he returned. Skywalker would keep up the ruse for a while, staying a Jedi Master and raising his children. The only reason Anakin did this is because he loved teaching, and so shortly after the war ended, he picked up another student in Desha Numa, a young Twi'lek girl who'd excelled in her classes at a young age, similar to what Ahsoka had done previously. Barra Sophie would never be convicted of what she did to the Jedi Temple, and she would live a life full of regret inside the temple itself. The galaxy itself would actually heal, and so would Skywalker in this new era of peace, justice, and love for all across the galaxy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks Benjamin Wells, Jonathan, Pimp Daddy Bane, Darth Jeezy, Apollo, Mad Many Studios, Anakin003, Lemon Knight, and Flynn Van Cease for supporting the channel. Hit 2,000 likes in this video. I don't know what's coming next, but it really is. If you want to see a what if, let me know below. I read off the comments, but I don't do crossovers. Check out the Twitch, get a Discord, or Patreon. If you want to support me in other ways, go down below. There is a merch store. Pride of the Empire merch is out until Season 1 of the Earth series is over, and the Broken One is also a limited time merch. Otherwise, let's talk about our story. So, first things first, Legacy of the Chosen One. As I always say in every video ever, I don't follow the Legacy of the Chosen One. I don't follow how it's literally meant to bring balance to the Force. That I don't do every video. It would be boring if every video was meant to have the same conclusion. Okay? Same page? Cool. Let's talk about Anakin's emotions as a character, because that's something integral to the story. And the integral part of the story is how the Jedi are able to actually get themselves out of Anakin's hate. Anakin obviously has this disdain for the Jedi, and that's very obvious going into the later seasons of the Clone Wars. And so the main point of this was actually to show how the Jedi would actually try and reconcile with Anakin. Now, they wouldn't do that with Ahsoka still being alive. Now, I really want to emphasize the difference in her surviving and her not surviving. Say, with Ahsoka dying because of an execution, the Jedi are kind of going to be worried about Anakin. You know, if Ahsoka lives, they're not going to be as worried because she's still alive. You know, she still exists. She's not dead. She hasn't been executed or anything. She's still a functional living being. But Ahsoka was executed. The Jedi are going to be really worried about Anakin, and I think that's the truth. While yes, the Jedi are Jedi, I think that the few Jedi that I mentioned, Plo Koon, Shakti, Yoda, and Obi-Wan, would all be really worried about Anakin. And I know, like, a lot of people don't believe Yoda would be part of that, but I do believe Yoda would be. You see that in Revenge of the Sith, and you also see that throughout the Clone Wars. Yoda is the one that did give Ahsoka to Anakin. That was Yoda's doing. Yoda did that. And so Yoda did want the best for Anakin. He did that. He gave Ahsoka to Anakin because he believed that'd be best for Anakin. And that was the truth. And so I believe that Yoda would try his best to inspire Anakin. I really wanted to focus on how all these different Jedi would try and inspire Anakin. Now, Plo Koon is probably the most, like, sealed off from his emotions of all these Jedi, and so that's why he didn't really have an in-person dealing with Anakin. Instead, he left him a message. And I think that would be best for Plo to do. Obi-Wan having his personal interaction with Anakin and dropping off at Padme's would really be something for Anakin to really rally behind and just be like, oh, Obi-Wan does understand, type of thing. And so Anakin's emotions are kind of really pivotal in the middle of the story. And they're really important because, you know, the story doesn't really go anywhere without focusing on them. It's focus on his story as a character. And I think Palpatine would honestly not really do really well with trying to play the victim in a situation that he had full control over. And overarchingly, like, that's the main thing. Like, Palpatine is always going to be seen as the villain in this because he was the judge, you know, he was the person overseeing the court case. There's no way that Anakin's gonna look at Palpatine the same. Even if Palpatine first apologizes after it happens, Anakin's not gonna be like, oh yeah, it's totally fine, dude, you just killed my apprentice. Like, no, he's gonna be like, you psycho, you just killed my apprentice, and now you're apologizing to me? Like, no, you had full control over that. And so I think it's one of those things that would backfire on Palpatine. So otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this story. Thank you for continuously supporting me throughout my move. It has been really, well, it's been a lot. So, finally going to be back into regular uploads. Otherwise, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.